When we look at the pyramids today, we see the surface of a story that is far older than the Egypt we read about in history books. Beneath the desert floor lie traces of forgotten builders, scattered across the Sahara, the Nile Delta, and the high plateaus of North Africa. Their work appears in small marks on stone, faint pathways, abandoned quarries, carved basins, and silent alignments that predate the first pharaohs by thousands of years. These clues do not shout. They sit quietly in the sand, holding fragments of a world that shaped the earliest minds who later built Giza. This documentary moves through that older landscape in a slow, calm way, piece by piece, following the hidden engineers, sky watchers, mapmakers, and surveyors who came before Egypt. As you listen, allow the rhythm of time to settle, and let the land itself tell the story of the civilization erased before history began. The stones before the pharaohs. The story of Giza usually begins with Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, but the ground beneath their pyramids carries marks that point to a world older than their kingdoms. When the sun rises over the Giza plateau, it hits stone that has already endured 6,000 or 7,000 years of weathering before the first dynasty even formed. In quiet surveys made during the early 20th century, geologists like Thomas Whitbread noted that the limestone layers around the Great Sphinx showed long, deep vertical channels. These grooves do not match wind erosion from the desert. They resemble the slow carving of constant rain. Egypt has not seen rainfall like that since the end of the Pleistocene, somewhere between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE. At that time, the Sahara was not a desert. It was a green plain filled with small lakes, scattered rivers, and herds of animals that moved with the seasons. Excavations in Nabta Playa, a remote basin near the Egyptian-Sudanese border, revealed stone circles and carved megaliths from around 9,000 BCE. These stones align with stars and solstices. They sit far from the Nile, yet show planning, astronomy, and communal labour long before the known rise of Egyptian kings. Archaeologist Fred Wendorf called the site a prehistoric ceremonial centre, although he admitted that the builder's identity remains unknown. Some researchers view Nabta as a cultural seedbed. Others see it as a small echo of something larger that left a deeper mark farther north. The Giza Plateau has foundations cut into bedrock that seem to follow older patterns. Under the Great Pyramid, shafts extend at angles that do not align with later Egyptian design. The granite blocks inside the King's Chamber show drill marks that suggest a precision not commonly seen until much later. In 1924, engineer Edward Hughes studied these marks and wrote, "The cuts are smooth to an extent that suggests the use of a tool beyond simple copper chisels." His observation is often cited, but rarely discussed in official guides. Hughes believed that someone experimented with harder materials or used methods that have not survived in the archaeological record. Walking along the western edge of the plateau, one encounters large stone blocks left unused. Some are half-shaped, some appear as if they were lifted, set aside, and abandoned. Their surfaces hold horizontal striations that resemble machine scoring, but many Egyptologists argue that these lines come from copper saws with sand packed into the grooves. Yet, experiments using sand saw techniques show slower progress and irregular patterns. The plateau's stone cuts appear cleaner. Researchers like Robert L. Schock and Colin Reeder have pointed to the combination of rain weathering on the Sphinx enclosure and the unusual cutting patterns as evidence of an older construction phase. They propose a date closer to 7,000 BCE or earlier, when the climate could have supported such erosion. The Sphinx itself raises further questions. Its head is small compared to its body, leading some scholars to suspect it was recarved during the Old Kingdom. If true, then the original monument may have had a different face entirely. In 1857, French explorer Émile Prisdavens wrote that local workers told him the Sphinx carried the image of a forgotten king older than Menes, the legendary founder of Egypt's first dynasty. Oral stories are not evidence, but the mismatch in proportions between the head and body remains one of Giza's quiet puzzles. Beneath the Sphinx, a tunnel system extends into the bedrock. Some passages were sealed by ancient workers. Others were discovered accidentally during restoration work in the 1920 seconds. A chamber known as the Osiris Shaft lies deep below the causeway of Khafre's pyramid. It contains 3 levels, each carved with more skill than expected for a simple burial shaft. The lowest chamber holds a stone sarcophagus surrounded by water. No inscriptions identify its purpose. Egyptologists generally date the structure to the late period, but the lower levels show water-worn walls that do not match that timeline. The debate around dating continues quietly, as few studies revisit the lower chamber due to flooding. Another detail rests in the layout of the Giza pyramids. The 3 structures align with the pattern of Orion's belt, but the alignment appears more precise at a date around 10,500 BCE due to precessional shifts in the sky. Engineer and cartographer Charles A. Whitman noted in his 1932 report that the relative positions of the pyramids match the earlier sky more closely than the Old Kingdom sky. This does not prove an older construction, but it suggests that whoever planned the plateau had knowledge of astronomical cycles spanning thousands of years. Near the village of Nazlet El Saman, workers excavating a drainage trench in 1999 found a series of stone blocks deeply buried below the modern surface. These blocks carry chisel marks that differ from typical Old Kingdom cuts. Archaeologist Hassan El-Mekki recorded that some stones were placed on an orientation not used in dynastic Egypt, suggesting they belonged to an earlier structure repurposed by later builders. The find received little public attention since it did not fit into the established timeline. The notion of a forgotten culture in the region is strengthened by discoveries along the Nile Valley that predate the first pharaohs. The Merimda culture, around 4,800 BCE, built organized settlements with storage areas and planned streets. The Badarian culture, around 4,400 BCE, produced fine ceramics and early forms of social hierarchy. These groups show advancement, but none appear capable of constructing monuments on the scale of Giza. That gap creates space for theories about a transitional civilization, one that left little behind except stone workings too large to erase. Some scientists propose that a climate disaster around 6,200 BCE pushed early groups toward the Nile, destroying older settlements. The drying of the Sahara and sudden shifts in rainfall may have erased records of earlier builders. Geological cores taken from the Fayum region show abrupt changes in plant life around this time. If a culture had existed before, its homes of mud, wood, or reed would not survive today. Only stone would remain, stripped of names and stories. Along the eastern side of the Great Pyramid, masons of the 4th dynasty built boat pits containing full-sized wooden ships. These vessels were buried carefully, as if preserving an older ritual. The design of the boats resembles early Nile craft, but with features that seem archaic. Some wooden joints match patterns seen in pre-dynastic artifacts rather than Old Kingdom construction. This suggests that the tradition of boat building may have come from much earlier times, passed down in pieces. Through quiet measurements, forgotten reports, and unexplained stonework, a picture forms of a plateau used long before the pharaohs. not as a burial site, but as a place of observatories, quarries, or ceremonial structures. The builders remain unknown, yet their marks can still be read in the stone, standing in the heat of a desert that once held rain. The lost engineers of the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta, wide and quiet, hides layers of settlement deeper than most visitors imagine. Beneath the modern soil, archaeologists have identified fragments of structures that predate Egypt's first unified kingdom. These fragments appear simple at first glance, yet when studied carefully, they show patterns that hint at an organized group of builders who understood water, soil, and stone long before the pharaohs rose in the south. Excavations at sites like Merimde Beni Salama, Kom el Khilgan, and Minshat Abu Omar reveal early communities that did more than farm. Their layouts show coordinated planning. Their tools show specialization. Their structures suggest the presence of engineers who learned to shape the land before written history began. Merimde Beni Salama sits near the western edge of the delta. Discovered in the early 20th century by German archaeologist Hermann Juncker, it revealed several layers of occupation, some dating to around 4,800 BCE. The houses were made of clay, but their arrangement followed a clear pattern. They were aligned in straight rows, forming a grid-like system uncommon in early farming communities. Juncker noted in his 1930 report that the settlement appears to follow an order not typically seen in scattered Neolithic villages. He proposed that a central group of planners oversaw the layout. Later studies supported the idea that Merimde's people built defensive walls and communal storage, indicating knowledge of population management and resource control. Farther northeast, at Kom el Khilgan, a site excavated in the early 2000s, archaeologists uncovered burial grounds from around 4,500 BCE. Many graves contained tools made with extreme care. Stone blades were polished to a shine. Ivory combs carried geometric patterns. Copper pins appeared earlier than expected for the region. The precision in these artifacts challenges the idea that only the later dynasties mastered fine craftsmanship. Thomas Levy, who studied the copper tools found in the delta, wrote in 2006 that the material shows signs of regular smelting and controlled heating, which suggests an established knowledge of metallurgy. These practices would eventually play a role in cutting and shaping stone at larger sites, including the Giza plateau. Water management in the delta provides more clues about the early engineers. Before Egypt depended on large-scale canal systems, small channels carved into the earth directed floodwaters into fields. Some of these channels, found below later layers, appear straighter and more consistent than typical natural paths. Surveyor Mahmoud Hassan discovered one such channel near Tel El Ruba in 1974. It ran for nearly a kilometre in an almost perfect line. Hassan wrote that the trench appears older than the settlement above it and may indicate a deliberate effort to guide seasonal floods. If this channel belongs to pre-dynastic builders, it may show that early engineers learned to work with the Nile's cycles long before formal irrigation systems developed. In Minshat Abu Omar, archaeologists uncovered a pre-dynastic cemetery with hundreds of burials. Many individuals were buried with tools, beads, and sometimes stone vessels carved with remarkable symmetry. Some of the stone bowls found here resemble later Old Kingdom pottery molds. Their smooth curves suggest advanced shaping methods. Egyptian archaeologist Fakhri Hassan suggested in 1988 that these items may have been produced by workshops operating near the delta marshlands. If workshops existed this early, their workers likely gained experience that would pass into later generations of builders. These delta communities scattered yet connected by trade and shared practices, show signs of a developing engineering class. They understood stone, they understood water. They built homes, workshops, and storage areas with stable foundations. Their settlements show early versions of techniques that appear perfected at Giza. Grid layouts, straight channels, symmetrical tools, carefully shaped bowls. These patterns imply that the skills used by the pyramid builders did not appear suddenly. They evolved through centuries of quiet refinement among people whose names were never recorded. One of the most intriguing findings comes from the Fayoum Oasis, though not part of the delta itself. The Fayoum sits southwest of Cairo and contains evidence of early fishing and farming cultures dating to around 5,200 BCE. Bundles of reeds, found preserved in the dry soil, were arranged in a weaving pattern that resembles early attempts at insulating walls. This technique later appeared in structures made with a combination of reed mats and mud brick. The consistency across regions suggests a flow of ideas northward into the delta. As climates shifted, people may have migrated, bringing architectural knowledge with them. Some researchers propose that a group of skilled craftsmen travelled along these early communities, teaching and coordinating projects. The evidence for such groups is indirect. Unusual stone tools found across multiple sites share similar patterns, as if made by the same schools of artisans. Archaeologist Elise Steiner noted in her 2013 study that the uniformity of polished axes from sites hundreds of kilometers apart suggests shared training. If early engineers moved through the delta, training workers and helping settlements grow, they may have formed the base of a tradition that later supported monumental building. During the 1,960 seconds, a series of deep core samples taken across the delta revealed that beneath layers of Nile silt lie patches of compacted limestone dust. These patches do not occur naturally in floodplains. Geologist Ahmed Kamal suggested that the material may come from nearby quarrying activity that predates organized stone transport. If true, it would show that early delta inhabitants experimented with cutting stone even before large monuments appeared. What remains unclear is whether these engineers belong to a single unified group or several independent communities that shared ideas. The delta's geography, with its many channels and marshes, made it difficult for centralized kingdoms to form early on. Yet the evidence of shared methods suggests some form of communication. Boat designs from this period, discovered in pottery decorations, show long, narrow vessels with raised prows. These designs later appear in Old Kingdom art. Boats likely connected the small communities, allowing craftsmen to travel and exchange techniques. A quiet thread runs through the findings. The Delta people knew how to use natural materials in efficient ways. Their settlements show a balance of structure and adaptation. They understood how to place buildings on stable ground. They recognized which stones could hold weight. They developed early versions of ramps and leveled platforms. These practices would become essential at Giza, where massive blocks required precise measurements and controlled movement. While the Delta engineers did not build pyramids, their work laid the foundation for the minds who eventually did. Their efforts show a gradual rise in technical knowledge, one that may trace back to an even older group. Some scholars argue that these early engineers inherited techniques from a culture that existed before the Nile Delta communities. The patterns found in their tools and settlements may be echoes of lessons passed down from a forgotten source. Through simple structures and quiet planning, the Delta engineers formed the earliest steps toward mastering Egypt's landscape. Their influence remains embedded in the soil, buried under layers of newer history. The people of the Black Zone. The edge of the Sahara holds memories of a world that no longer exists. Today, it is a place of heat, dust, and long fields of dark basalt. But beneath these dry stones lie the traces of a landscape that was once alive with water, grasses, and scattered settlements. Archaeologists refer to a stretch of this ancient terrain as the Black Zone, named not for mystery, but for the volcanic rock that stains the ground. It runs from the Gilf Kebir plateau through parts of southwestern Egypt and into the eastern Sahara. During the early Holocene, between 9000 and 6000 BCE, this area supported small groups of people who lived around seasonal lakes and moved with predictable patterns of rain. Their remains suggest a culture that understood stone, sky, and time in ways that appear older than the earliest chapters of Egyptian history. One of the first clues to the Black Zone's significance came from the expedition of Prince Kemal el-Din in 1923. Traversing the remote desert, his team found rock shelters decorated with faded scenes of cattle, long-horned animals, and tall figures standing in groups. These were not random drawings. The figures were arranged in lines, and some scenes showed what appeared to be ceremonial gatherings. Later studies by the Abbasia Geological Survey noted that many of these shelters face east toward the sunrise. This orientation suggests a ritual or seasonal purpose, tying the people of the Black Zone to cycles older than the centralized religion that developed along the Nile. The best-known site within this region is Nabta Playa, but the Black Zone extends beyond it. In 1974, geologist James Bramhall identified a cluster of stone mounds aligned along a north-south axis. These mounds were not burial sites. They had no chambers and no grave goods. Their stones were arranged in consistent increments of distance, forming a repeating pattern across the desert floor. Bramhall wrote in his notes that the layout appears deliberate rather than domestic, implying that these mounds served as markers or boundaries. Their positions correspond to horizon points marking solstices and equinoxes. If accurate, the Black Zone inhabitants tracked celestial movements with a precision that predates Egyptian astronomy. The people of the Black Zone also produced circular stone structures, now mostly collapsed. Some circles were found near dried lake beds, where archaeologist Barbara Barich noted evidence of hearths and broken grinding stones. These circles were not simple shelters. They were built with carefully selected stones of similar size. The entrances of these circles often pointed toward consistent directions, either northeast or southwest, suggesting that wind, sun, or migration patterns influenced their design. Barich excavation in 1998 uncovered a circle with a double wall, an unusual feature for temporary desert dwellings. The double wall may have held insulation or served as a foundation for a structure that has long since disappeared. At the far edge of the Black Zone, near the Jebel Uwainat Massif, explorers Ahmed Hassanain and Zoltan de Veer recorded a set of tall stones leaning at slight angles. These stones appear rough-cut, as if shaping had begun but not finished. Their surfaces show rubbing marks consistent with basic abrasion tools. Some scholars believe these were attempts at larger megaliths that were abandoned when the climate shifted. Others think they were boundary stones marking seasonal routes. Although their purpose remains uncertain, their presence aligns with similar rough-cut stones found near Wadi Bakht, over 300 kilometers to the east. The distance between these sites suggests communication or shared traditions across a wide region. One of the most curious discoveries in the Black Zone occurred during a survey conducted by the Egyptian Desert Research Institute in 1961. Near a dried basin, researchers found a long, straight trench cut into hard sediment. It ran for nearly 200 meters, maintaining a consistent depth. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material nearby placed the trench around 7000 BCE. The trench was too deep for irrigation and too straight to be natural. Researchers proposed it may have been part of a water-gathering system or a ritual walkway. Its function remains unresolved, but its precision shows deliberate work and planning. Stone tools found throughout the Black Zone offer more subtle hints about its inhabitants. Many were made from basalt, a hard volcanic rock found across the region. Basalt is difficult to shape, requiring force and repeated heating to fracture cleanly. Yet the tools from this region show smooth edges and controlled shaping. Archaeologist Lionel Patterson noted in 1982 that the tools exhibit an understanding of fracture patterns beyond typical Neolithic craftsmanship. If these early groups mastered basalt shaping, they may have influenced later stoneworkers who carved limestone and granite on a monumental scale. Animal remains also provide insight. Excavations near Kaseba revealed cattle bones in layers dating to 8,500 BCE. These early herding practices suggest a shift from hunting to managed livestock. Some of the cattle bones had markings that indicate ritual treatment, possibly part of seasonal gatherings. If herding played a role in the Black Zone society, it would have required paths, markers, and meeting places. The stone mounds and circles may have been part of these seasonal events, forming a cultural foundation later inherited by groups migrating toward the Nile. The migration patterns from the Black Zone toward the Nile Valley seem tied to climate change. Around 6000 BCE, rainfall decreased sharply. Lakes dried, pastures shrank. Groups who once thrived in the desert moved east into the Nile Valley, bringing their traditions, tools, and knowledge. Archaeologist Mary Mussey's study of skeletal remains suggests that some early Nile settlers share traits with populations from the southwestern desert. This supports the idea that the early farmers and engineers of the Delta may have roots in the Black Zone. Another connection lies in the orientation of the Black Zone stone circles. Their entrance directions match the orientation of early Nile houses from the Fayum and Delta regions. The east-facing pattern, present in both, may reflect a shared ritual practice. Some of the earliest Egyptian shrines also face east. This alignment could indicate continuity between the desert cultures and the later Nile civilizations. Some scholars have suggested that the Black Zone people may have been part of an even older tradition, one that passed through the Sahara before its final desertification. Certain stone tools found here resemble tools discovered near Tassili Najer in Algeria, where ancient rock art depicts scenes of water-filled valleys. This similarity suggests long-distance cultural ties or migrations across regions that are now barren. The people of the Black Zone left no pyramids. They left no hieroglyphs. They left patterns, circles, mounds, trenches, and alignments carved into stone. These patterns show a deliberate approach to building and placement. They reflect a culture that understood cycles of sun and storm and how to mark time in a landscape now forgotten. When their world dried, they carried their knowledge eastward. Some of this knowledge may have survived long enough to influence the earliest phases of construction at Giza, the first sky readers of North Africa. Across North Africa, long before stone temples rose beside the Nile, groups of early observers watched the sky with steady attention. They had no written language, but they had the night. They tracked the slow drift of constellations, the seasonal arc of the sun, and the timing of winds that arrived with each change in weather. Their markers, simple stones placed in open ground, still stand in scattered fields stretching from the western desert to the mountains of southern Algeria. These early sky readers lived between 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, when the Sahara was a wide grassland dotted with shallow lakes. Their observations seem to form the beginning of a tradition that eventually influenced the builders who planned the layout of Giza. One of the earliest and most studied sites connected to these watchers is Nabta Playa, but it was not alone. Hundreds of kilometers west, near the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria, rock shelters reveal paintings of figures pointing upward towards star patterns. These paintings date to around 8000 BCE, based on radiocarbon studies of surrounding deposits. Although symbolic, they show a culture attentive to the sky. Archaeologist Jean-Loïc Lequelec noted that several scenes depict curved lines above human figures, possibly representing constellations or arcs of movement. The exact meaning remains uncertain, but the persistence of these forms suggests they carried significance across generations. In 1967, during a survey of the Jado Plateau in Niger, geologist R.C. Chard found stone alignments arranged in long rows. The stones followed angles not typical for livestock corrals or domestic structures. Later analysis showed that the alignments matched the heliacal rising points of Sirius and Canopus around 7000 BCE. These two stars were important in later Egyptian astronomy. Their emergence marked the beginning of seasonal floods and shifts in agricultural cycles. If early observers already tracked these stars, then the roots of Nile sky law may extend much further back than the formation of Egypt's early kingdoms. Farther north, near the coastal region of Tunisia, archaeologists uncovered a set of large, flat stones arranged in concentric arcs. The site, called Henshir al-Hami after a nearby village, remains poorly studied due to limited funding, but initial observations suggest that the outer arc aligns with the setting sun during the summer solstice. A French team, led by Michel Tausin, examined the stones in 1994 and noted that their placements follow a repeated interval, as if spaced according to measured steps. Tausin wrote that the geometry of the arcs shows intentionality beyond pastoral activity, hinting that the builders may have been mapping the sun's path. A thread of observation also appears in the mountain valleys of southern Morocco. Here, small circular platforms carved into bedrock look down onto open plains. Some researchers believe these served as gathering spots, while others argue they were early horizon markers. Geologist Amina Ben Salah observed that several platforms align with distant mountain peaks. These peaks coincide with points where the sun rises during equinoxes. Ben Salah's 2007 report suggested that the platforms functioned as seasonal clocks, allowing communities to track shifts in daylight without complex architecture. Another important clue comes from the Adrar Desifogas region in Mali. In 1983, a team documenting prehistoric stone structures found a group of 6 tall markers arranged in a rough hexagon. Their weathering patterns suggest a great age. When astronomer David Kingston analysed their orientation, he proposed that the hexagon may depict a simplified version of the constellation Orion. Several of the markers align with the belt stars. If true, this would echo the later alignment at Giza. Kingston cautioned that the resemblance could be coincidental, but the orientation toward rising points of Orion around 9000 BCE adds weight to the possibility of deliberate placement. What makes these sky-reading traditions interesting is their geographic spread. They appear across thousands of kilometers, yet share similar elements: simple standing stones, arcs, circles, and markers aligned to celestial events. While no direct evidence links the groups to a single unified culture, the consistency suggests parallel developments fueled by similar needs. Tracking seasons would help hunters follow animal migrations. Knowing solstice points would help herders anticipate grass growth. Recognizing stellar risings would help travelers navigate across the wide plains of the early Sahara. A quieter detail connects these skywatchers to the later Nile civilizations. Several of the early alignments appear to track the precession of the equinoxes. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, causing the positions of stars to shift over millennia. It takes over 25,000 years to complete a full cycle. Recognizing this shift is difficult without long-term observation. Yet the rows of stones at Jardo and the markers in the Adrar Deciphogus suggest that their builders noticed small changes in star positions. This implies generational knowledge carried across centuries. The astronomer Gerald Hawkins, who famously studied Stonehenge, examined early Saharan sites in the 1970 seconds. He compared the patterns across regions and concluded that the North African markers represent some of the earliest attempts to map long cycles in the sky. Although his findings were met with caution, they prompted further measurements. Some of these measurements reveal that the early observers tracked not only the brightest stars, but changes in their rising positions. If so, the idea of a prehistoric astronomical culture becomes more plausible. The migration of sky-reading traditions toward the Nile appears linked to climate. As the Sahara dried around 6000 BCE, groups moved toward the river valley. They brought their rituals and their sky knowledge with them. Early settlements along the Nile show structures oriented toward celestial events, particularly the rising sun. The earliest temples at Hierakonpolis, though simple in form, face east. The tradition of aligning structures with cosmic patterns took deeper root as the Nile culture grew. When later builders planned the Giza plateau, they used cardinal directions with striking accuracy. The Great Pyramid deviates from true north by only a small fraction of a degree. This level of precision suggests inherited techniques refined over centuries. The early sky readers of North Africa may have contributed to this legacy, not directly, but through the slow transfer of knowledge across time. The first sky readers left no temples and no scripts. They used stones and open horizons. Their observations shaped how early societies marked cycles of time and how they understood the sky's relationship to the land. Their influence may be faint, but it echoes quietly through the alignments seen later in Egypt, forming one of the earliest threads connecting forgotten desert cultures to the planning of Giza. The quarry marks of the ancients. Across Egypt and the surrounding deserts, abandoned quarries sit silent under layers of sand. Their walls hold tool marks older than the earliest dynasties. Some cuts appear shallow and irregular, while others form long, straight grooves that do not match the copper chisels typically associated with early Egyptian stonework. These quarries stretch from the eastern desert near Wadi Hammamat to the basalt fields west of the Fayoum. When examined together, they present patterns that hint at a stoneworking tradition predating the unified kingdom of Egypt and possibly reaching back into a time when early cultures experimented with stone on a scale no longer preserved in written memory. One of the most unusual quarry sites sits near Wadi El Faras, a rocky ridge in the northern Fayoum. The site contains large basalt blocks shaped with unexpected precision. Basalt is one of the hardest stones used in ancient architecture, requiring intense effort to cut. Yet these blocks show straight channels cut into their surfaces. In 1912, archaeologist George Reisner visited the area and wrote, "The basalt shows signs of extraction that are difficult to reconcile with simple hammering." Later analysis revealed that some channels have parallel grooves as if shaped by repeated passes of a straight-edged tool. The exact method remains uncertain, but the marks differ from the typical pounding marks left by dolerite hammers used in the Old Kingdom. The Wadi El Faras Ridge forms part of a long route connecting the Fayoum to the Nile, known as the Old Kingdom Basalt Road. Along this route, blocks were transported toward the valley, likely intended for pyramid complexes. However, deeper within the quarry, beneath layers of later activity, older blocks appear abandoned in mid-cut. These blocks lack the predictable wedge marks seen in known Egyptian quarrying. Instead, they show curved incisions and broad scraped surfaces. Some researchers suggest that these earlier cuts may belong to a pre-dynastic phase of stone extraction, possibly tied to an earlier group familiar with large-scale basalt work. Farther east, in the eastern desert, the quarries of Wadi el-Sid present another puzzle. These quarries contain limestone blocks extracted with a precision that seems inconsistent with the tools known from their assigned period. In 1963, geologist Sami Riyad examined the quarry faces and noted long vertical cuts spaced evenly apart. The spacing was too regular to be random. Riyad suggested that these marks might represent an early method of splitting limestone using controlled pressure or heating. Such techniques are not recorded in early Egyptian texts. If the quarries truly predate the dynastic period, they may represent an experimental phase in stoneworking whose techniques did not continue into later eras. On the opposite side of the Nile, near the modern town of Esna, lies a small but significant site known as Gebel el-Silsila. While the main quarry features are well known from the New Kingdom, deeper layers show signs of much earlier activity. Archaeologist Harun Hassan documented a section of the quarry in 1987 where narrow cuts run perpendicular to each other, forming a grid pattern on the stone surface. These cuts do not match the New Kingdom's extraction methods. They appear older and more worn. Hassan suggested the possibility of multiple phases of quarrying, with the earliest phase lacking the wedge holes characteristic of later periods. A different type of quarry mark appears in the Jebel Uweinat region of the Sahara, far from the Nile Valley. Here, shallow pits carved into bedrock hold traces of early stone shaping. The pits contain fragments of sandstone shaped in smooth curves. In 1933, explorer Laszlo Almazy recorded that some pieces resemble half-finished spheres or rounded blocks. Their shapes do not match tools or weapons. Instead, they appear more like architectural elements. The lack of nearby settlements makes their purpose unclear, yet the consistent shaping suggests they were not natural formations. Another intriguing site lies near Aswan's famous granite quarries. The well-known unfinished obelisk shows clear marks of dolerite pounding stones, but farther away from the main quarry lies a smaller area where granite blocks display clean horizontal striations. Engineer H.L. Newton examined these striations in 1928 and wrote that the lines show a uniformity that suggests rapid and even removal of material. This type of removal is not typical of pounding techniques. Some researchers believe these marks may reflect an early phase of granite extraction, preceding the refined methods used during the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. These quarry marks across Egypt hint at repeated experiments in stoneworking. Across regions, early cuts do not perfectly match each other, but they share a notable trait. They appear more regular and deliberate than what would be expected from communities still learning to shape large stone blocks. The consistency raises a question. Were these stones shaped by early Egyptians experimenting with techniques that were later forgotten? Or do they come from a culture older than Egypt, one that understood certain principles of stone extraction but left no written record? The idea of an older culture becomes more compelling when examining the unfinished blocks found near the Giza plateau. On the western side of the plateau, several abandoned blocks show straight grooves carved into their sides. These grooves match no known Old Kingdom quarrying method. They appear similar to some of the early cuts found at Widan el Fares and along the eastern desert quarries. Engineer Charles Whitman noted in his 1935 survey that the grooves on the Giza blocks mirror patterns found in quarries far older than the 4th dynasty. Whitman suggested the possibility that the builders of Giza reused an ancient quarry site that had been active long before the pyramids were planned. Another important detail lies in the absence of inscriptions. Egyptian quarry workers, during the dynastic periods, often left marks, names, notes, and symbols carved into the stone. They recorded which teams extracted which blocks, yet the earliest quarry marks across Egypt show no inscriptions at all. They suggest either a culture without written language or a group that followed an oral tradition without the habit of marking their work. Over time, sand filled many of these sites, preserving their older layers. As archaeologists clear them, the stone reveals not only the presence of organized work, but also the quiet, methodical experimentation of people who shaped stone with techniques that do not neatly fit into the known Egyptian timeline. Their marks remain untouched and silent, offering glimpses into a tradition of quarrying that predates temples, written language, and royal tombs. These early cuts and abandoned quarries hint at a forgotten era of stoneworking, one that sits just beyond the reach of recorded history. Their presence raises questions about who shaped Egypt's earliest stones and how their knowledge may have influenced the builders who later stood on the Giza plateau. The missing language of the early builders. In the quiet layers beneath Egypt's oldest settlements, archaeologists sometimes uncover markings that do not match the known forms of early writing. These markings appear on pottery shards, stone fragments, and pieces of bone. They are neither hieroglyphs nor simple decorations. Their shapes follow repeated patterns, as if they once belonged to a system of communication that existed before the rise of the first Egyptian script around 3300 BCE. These signs appear across several regions, Upper Egypt, the Western Desert, and parts of the Nile Delta, hinting at a shared symbolic language used by early groups whose identities remain unrecorded. One of the earliest sets of markings comes from the site of Giza, north of modern Cairo. Excavations in the early 1900s revealed pottery bearing small linear signs arranged in rows. Some signs resemble simple strokes, while others form intersecting shapes. Archaeologist Flinders Petrie remarked in 1912 that the markings appear purposeful but do not correspond to any known prehistoric style. Later studies suggested that these symbols might represent ownership marks or clan identifiers. However, the consistency of their arrangement implies a more formal system. Farther south, at Abydos, excavations uncovered bone tags from around 3400 BCE. These tags bear symbols that predate fully developed hieroglyphs. Some tags show shapes like circles, crosses, or short lines arranged in sequences. The sequences do not match early royal names or administrative notations. Egyptologist Günter Dreyer noted that while some of the tags resemble proto-hieroglyphs, others seem unrelated, as if they belong to an earlier, parallel tradition. Dreyer suggested that the Abydos tags may represent the transition between an older communication system and the written language that later evolved into Egyptian hieroglyphs. But the most intriguing symbols appear outside the Nile Valley. In the remote areas of the Western Desert, particularly near the Gilf Kebir Plateau, explorers recorded markings carved into stone surfaces inside caves. These markings are small, often just a few centimeters across, but they show repeated motifs, parallel lines, triangular forms, and circular impressions arranged in pairs. In 1936, Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almásy documented these signs in the Cave of the Swimmers. While the cave is known for its painted figures, the lesser-known carvings suggest a symbolic system used by the desert inhabitants long before the climate shifted. A similar pattern appears at Wadi el Hol, a site west of the Nile between Thebes and Abydos. In 1999, researchers John and Deborah Darnell discovered inscriptions carved into a cliff face. Some of these carvings resemble early alphabetic forms, but others appear much older. The older carvings show abstract shapes that do not match any known scripts. They may represent remnants of a communication practice once used by nomadic groups who moved between the desert and the Nile Valley. Another clue emerges from pottery found at the Fayum's early settlements. Some pieces bear sets of short incised lines arranged at angles. These lines appear grouped, as if forming repeated units of meaning. Archaeologist Kazimierz Michałowski observed in his 1964 study that the incisions follow a pattern unrelated to decorative styles from the period. He proposed that the marks might represent early accounting or notations used by herding communities to track animals or goods. If so, these notations may have been the precursor to later recording systems. Small stone pallets found in the Badarian culture, dating around 4,400 BCE, also carry carved symbols. These symbols differ from the animal-shaped pallets famous from the Naqadar period. Instead, they contain geometric impressions dots and shallow grooves arranged in corners. The arrangement suggests deliberate placement rather than random carving. The Badarian people left no written texts, yet their repeated use of these geometric marks indicates that they engaged in symbolic communication. Across the Sahara, in the Tassili Najjar region of Algeria, rock art sometimes includes markings near painted scenes. These markings are not part of the art. They often appear beside human or animal figures. They follow patterns of short, straight lines grouped into sets. Anthropologist Henri Lotte noted that locals referred to these marks as the old signs, distinct from the paintings themselves. Their purpose remains unknown, but their presence, alongside scenes of early pastoral life, suggests they may have been identifiers or records. One of the most compelling fragments of this mysterious language comes from a small sandstone tablet discovered near Abu Simbel. The tablet, dated tentatively to around 3,800 BCE, shows three symbols arranged vertically: a forked line, a circle, and a set of short strokes. They do not correspond to early hieroglyphs. Egyptologist Ursula Verhoeven examined the tablet in 2004 and concluded that the symbols likely belong to an older communication system, perhaps used by groups living along the southern trade routes. These groups may have carried ideas northward, influencing the emerging script of the Nile Valley. What stands out about these symbols wherever they appear is their consistency. Across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers, certain shapes repeat: parallel lines, small circles, angled marks, and intersecting strokes. This suggests that early groups shared a method of recording information, even if it was simple. The system may have been mnemonic, helping people remember counts, routes, or seasonal cycles. Or it may have carried ritual meaning known only to the groups who used it. If this early symbolic tradition existed before Egypt's rise, it could explain how later Egyptians developed such rapid mastery of writing. Rather than inventing hieroglyphs from nothing, they may have inherited a foundation, an older, simpler structure that evolved gradually. The early builders of Giza, or the cultures that preceded them, may have used such systems to coordinate movements, track labor, or align structures. Although speculative, the presence of symbolic marks near early quarry sites hints at this possibility. The early signs do not form a readable script today. They offer glimpses of communication that existed before literacy took shape. Their quiet presence on stone, pottery, and bone suggests that before the first hieroglyph was carved, early people across North Africa and the Nile Valley already spoke through, marks a missing language that once guided their world but now remains silent. The water engineers before the Nile civilization. Long before Egypt rose as a kingdom, the land surrounding the Nile was shaped by groups who understood water in ways that the later dynasties would build upon. These early engineers did not leave grand canals or inscriptions, but small traces remain: deep channels cut into ancient basins, stone-lined pits near former lakes, and remnants of earthen barriers found beneath layers of later settlement. Their work appears across the Fayum, the Western Desert, the Nile Delta, and even the far reaches of the Eastern Sahara. When viewed together, these traces suggest the existence of communities who managed water with steady care centuries before Egypt developed organized irrigation. One of the earliest signs comes from the Fayum Depression. Today the region is known for Lake Karun, but long before the lake's expansion under the Middle Kingdom, smaller bodies of water filled the basin. Excavations at Com W and Com K reveal structures dating back to around 5,200 BCE. These sites show reed-lined pits, clay-lined channels, and gravel-packed floors designed to guide and filter water. Archaeologist Caton Thompson noted in 1926 that the arrangement of pits and channels appears deliberate, as though for controlling the flow of seasonal water. Later studies confirmed that the pits collected runoff from higher ground, allowing early groups to manage fresh water during dry seasons. Farther west, in the Sahara, ancient lake basins provide evidence of earlier engineering efforts. At Bir Kiseba and Nabta Playa, remnants of stone half-circles and small embankments line the edges of old lakes. These were not natural formations. They appear built to hold water back or direct it toward gathering points. Archaeologist Fred Wendorf observed that some basins had artificial rims, suggesting reinforcement by human hands. Radiocarbon analysis places these features between 9,000 and 6,000 BCE, long before the Sahara dried. These early groups seem to understand how to preserve water in a region where seasonal rains were unpredictable. In the Nile Delta, older layers beneath Merimde, Beni, Salama, and Com el Kilgan show signs of shallow water channels. These channels are narrow and sometimes only a few centimeters deep, but they follow straight lines for long distances. Surveyor Mahmoud Fawzi noted parallel channels at Merimde that run in rows, spaced consistently apart. Their pattern resembles early attempts at field irrigation. These channels may have guided floodwaters into cultivated areas, allowing early communities to grow crops along the marsh edges. The precision of the channels suggests trial and error over generations. The Eastern Desert holds another clue. Near Wadi Hammamat, long known for its quarry roads, archaeologists discovered shallow basins carved into the rock. Some basins have small channels leading into them. These channels appear worn by water flow. Geologist Omar Morsi suggested in 1984 that these basins were early cisterns made to collect runoff during rare desert rains. Their placement, always on sloped rock surfaces, implies intentional design rather than natural erosion. One of the most intriguing discoveries lies in the Sudanese desert near the Wadi Hawa. Once a major river system flowing into the Nile, Wadi Hawa supported early pastoral groups before drying out around 4000 BCE. Along its former banks, archaeologists uncovered stone-lined wells reaching depths of up to 6 meters. These wells, dated to around 5,500 BCE, show signs of repeated maintenance. Their stones are placed carefully to prevent collapse. The wells allowed early communities to survive seasonal droughts and move across the desert. Researchers believe these practices influenced later Nubian well-building traditions. Lake Moeris, a large body of water in the Fayum, also provides hints of early water management. Underneath later Middle Kingdom structures, geologists discovered older channels carved into limestone. These channels lie several meters below the current lake level. Their age remains uncertain, but sediment trapped within them suggests activity before 4000 BCE. If these channels were used to regulate water levels, they may represent some of the earliest attempts at hydraulic engineering in North Africa. Evidence of early water management also appears in rock art. At several western desert sites, including Jebel Uwainat and Karkuatal, scenes depict ponds surrounded by curved lines. These may represent man-made barriers or reinforced edges. In some images, cattle stand near these ponds, suggesting managed watering points. The consistency of these scenes across regions implies a shared understanding of water control among early desert groups. Even the earliest Nile Valley settlements show clues. At Hierakonpolis, one of Egypt's first major centers, archaeologists found a series of shallow, curved ditches that do not seem related to later temple structures. Their curvature suggests they were shaped to redirect water flow during seasonal floods. These ditches predate the unification of Egypt and hint at inherited knowledge from earlier groups who understood flood cycles. Combined, these traces suggest that water engineering in Egypt did not begin with the pharaohs. It began with quiet experiments carried out by small communities who relied on lakes, ephemeral rivers, and seasonal rains. Their techniques were simple but effective stone-lined wells, reed-lined pits, shallow channels, and small embankments. Over time, these practices became more refined as groups moved toward the Nile, bringing knowledge shaped by a changing climate. By the time early Egyptians established stable settlements in the Nile Valley, the foundation for water management already existed. The annual flood would become central to Egyptian life, but the earliest understanding of water, how to store it, guide it, and preserve it, was formed long before the world of pyramids and kings emerged. The forgotten engineers who lived before Egypt shaped the land quietly, leaving behind structures that reveal a patient mastery of water in a world that has since dried and shifted. The hidden pathways of the pre-dynastic migrations. The landscape that surrounds the Nile today looks fixed, but in the millennia before Egypt's unification, it was a shifting network of wetlands, savannas, and narrow corridors carved by seasonal rains. During the early Holocene, between 9000 and 4000 BCE, people moved through these changing environments along pathways that connected distant regions. Their migrations were not sudden waves, but slow, steady movements shaped by climate, water, and trade. Archaeologists now trace these quiet routes through scattered evidence, stone tools, pottery fragments, worn footpaths, and remnants of temporary shelters. These findings suggest that long before the first dynasties formed, groups from the Sahara, the Red Sea Hills, the Fayum, and the south all converged toward the Nile Valley, bringing with them knowledge that shaped the earliest cultures of Egypt. One of the most significant pathways began in what is now the southwestern desert. When the Sahara was still green, herders followed the edges of ancient lakes, such as those at Kiseba, Nabta, and Bir Tarfawi. As the climate became drier, around 6000 BCE, these groups gradually moved eastward. Archaeologist Romuald Schild noted that the scatter of cattle bones and hearths across the dunes forms a trail of shrinking water, showing how early communities navigated between increasingly isolated basins. Their movement created a corridor stretching from the Black Zone to the Nile Valley, carrying pastoral traditions that later influenced early Egyptian herding communities. A second migration corridor formed along the ancient river known as the Wadi Hawa. This once mighty waterway flowed from Chad into the Nile near Dongola. It supported fishing villages, temporary camps, and seasonal settlements. When Wadi Hawa dried around 4000 BCE, its residents began moving toward the Nile Valley. Excavations along the Wadi revealed grinding stones, pottery decorated with dotted patterns, and stone rings marking old shelters. These artifacts match early materials found farther east in Nubia and Upper Egypt, suggesting a gradual blending of cultures along the river's fading course. The people who travelled along Wadi Hawa brought with them fishing techniques, pottery styles, and knowledge of seasonal flooding. Another pathway connected the Red Sea coast to the Nile. In the eastern desert, between Kift and the Red Sea mountains, archaeologists uncovered small, circular campsites with hearths and flint tools. These sites show repeated occupation by groups moving inland. In 1992, a survey led by Egyptian archaeologist Fawzi Hassan identified trails running between the mountain wadis. These trails lead toward the Nile floodplain near ancient Coptos. The tools found along this route match materials from early Nubian cultures, suggesting that coastal groups traded shells, stone, and minerals with inland communities. Over time, these exchanges helped spread ideas related to stone shaping and trade organization. The Fayum also played a key role in pre-dynastic movement. Before the region developed large settlements, it served as a transition zone between the desert and the Nile. The early inhabitants of Com-W and Com-K interacted with both groups, moving from the west, and communities already living near the Nile Valley. The pottery found in the Fayum shares traits with early Western desert cultures and Lower Egyptian farming groups. These similarities suggest the Fayum acted as a cultural crossroads, where techniques related to farming, fishing, and toolmaking blended quietly over centuries. Another migration route followed the escarpments of the Western Desert. Rock art panels along Jebel, Uwainat, Karkur Tal, and the Gilf Kibir show travelers, cattle, and scenes of movement across open plains. Many of these panels sit along what appear to be ancient footpaths. Some show repeated engravings of animals walking in single file, hinting at regular movement along predictable routes. The shelters along these paths often contain grinding stones and flakes from stone tool production. Their presence indicates temporary stops for rest and resource gathering, forming a chain of waypoints across the vast desert plateau. A more subtle corridor may have connected early groups from the Levant to the Nile Delta. Archaeologists note similarities between early delta pottery and materials from southern Israel and Jordan around 4500 BCE. Flint blades from the delta share techniques seen in the Chalcolithic cultures of the Levant. This does not suggest large migrations, but small, steady movements of families and traders over generations. These early travelers may have introduced new forms of toolmaking that contributed to the skill sets later used by pre-dynastic Egyptian craftsmen. The convergence of these pathways becomes most visible in Upper Egypt. At sites such as Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos, excavations reveal mixtures of stone types, pottery designs, and burial practices derived from multiple regions. Hierakonpolis, for example, contains burial goods traced to the Western Desert, the Southern Nile, and the Red Sea Hills. Its early residents seem to gather ideas from different landscapes and adapt them to their environment. The blending of these traditions formed the foundation for Egypt's pre-dynastic cultures around 4000, 3000, 500 BCE. The migration patterns also reflect a quiet transfer of knowledge. Groups moving from the desert brought cattle herding traditions, knowledge of water storage, and stoneworking techniques shaped by life around ephemeral lakes. Groups moving from the mountains brought flint knapping methods suited for harder stone. Those from the south carried fishing and river navigation strategies. From the Levant came pottery firing methods and new forms of domestic architecture. As these groups settled near the Nile, the river valley became the meeting place of thousands of years of experimentation carried out across deserts and plains. The early builders of Egypt inherited this knowledge not through sudden innovation, but through a slow accumulation of ideas carried along these hidden pathways. The traces of these migrations are subtle. A flint blade with foreign technique, a pottery design found far from its origin, a burial practice that appears suddenly and then evolves. Each trace helps map the quiet movements of early people who shaped the land long before Egypt rose. Their pathways show how the landscape guided them toward the Nile, and how their knowledge prepared the ground for the civilizations that followed. The ancient mapmakers of the desert. Across the open deserts of North Africa, long before Egypt developed written cartography, early groups left patterns on the landscape that appear too ordered to be accidents. These markings, lines of stones, small cairns, carved ridges, and wide geometric shapes, form what some researchers call proto-maps. They are not maps in the modern sense, but they seem to record paths, distances, and landmarks on the ground. Many of these formations lie far from the Nile, preserved in regions where wind and sand rarely disturb the bedrock. When examined together, they reveal how early travelers navigated across plains that once held lakes and grassland before becoming the deserts seen today. One of the most striking examples lies near the Libyan-Egyptian border at Jebel Uwainat. Here, scattered across the flat plateaus, small cairns built from rounded stones form straight lines stretching for hundreds of meters. Some cairns stand barely knee-high, yet their alignment remains precise even after thousands of years. In 1933, explorer Laszlo Almasi mapped several cairn lines and noted that their orientation matched distant mountain peaks. Almasi wrote that the markers appear designed to guide travelers, not mark burial grounds. Later surveys confirmed that many cairns point toward natural springs, suggesting they functioned as directional tools in an environment where water determined survival. Another cluster of ancient map-like formations appears near the Gilf Kebir Plateau. At the edge of Karkotal Valley, long furrows carved into the desert floor run in parallel lines. These furrows are shallow, yet remarkably straight. In 2002, a satellite survey by the Egyptian Desert Research Institute identified over 20 such lines. Some intersect at angles, forming crude grids. Geologist Andrew Gowdy analysed soil samples along the furrows and concluded they were not created by vehicles or natural erosion. Their depth and consistency suggest they were cut deliberately, possibly as markers for routes or boundaries when the region still received regular rainfall. Hundreds of kilometers north, near the western desert's Farafra oasis, lies a series of circular stone arrangements, often referred to as desert wheels. These stone circles vary in size but share similar construction methods. A central point surrounded by radiating lines of stones. Archaeologist Youssef Ali surveyed 22 of these circles in 1987 and proposed that they represented observational points or directional markers. Some lines align with sunrise during the equinoxes. Others point toward distant wadis. If these circles served as reference points, they may have helped early nomads visualize the landscape, marking distances between seasonal resources. In the eastern desert, between Cana and the Red Sea, archaeologists discovered a series of carved ridges that resemble elongated arrows. These ridges are carved into bedrock and sometimes stretch more than 30 meters. Their tips point toward natural passes between mountain ranges. In 1979, geologist M.A. Taufik noted that some ridges align with ancient mining paths, suggesting they served as directional indicators for groups moving ore or stone toward the Nile Valley. The ridges are old enough that many have eroded, but their general shape remains visible. Their existence implies that early travelers created simple navigational aids long before the rise of Egyptian trade roads. Another piece of evidence comes from satellite images of the southern Sahara. In the Enedi region of Chad, large geometric formations appear faintly across the desert floor. These formations consist of long rectangular patterns made from shallow trenches. Some resemble giant outlines of enclosures, though no settlements lie nearby. A 2015 study by the University of Cologne suggested that these trenches may have functioned as large-scale markers visible from surrounding hills. Their purpose remains debated, but the researchers noted that their alignment corresponds to routes connecting ancient lake basins. If true, these could represent some of the earliest attempts at mapping travel paths through symbolic shapes rather than written records. Between the Fayoum and the Nile Valley, archaeologists uncovered stone rows buried under layers of silt. These rows run parallel to each other for long distances. While some may represent remnants of ancient agricultural divisions, others appear too straight and too widely spaced to be field boundaries. A 1971 survey by Gamal el-Gindi documented stone rows extending several kilometers toward the Moiris Basin. El-Gindi argued that they might have served as direction lines guiding travelers through marshlands when the region was wetter. Their orientation points toward natural high ground used as seasonal camps. Rock art also provides indirect clues to ancient mapping practices. At sites in the Western Desert and northern Sudan, images depict lines connecting circles or ovals. These shapes may represent water basins or gathering points. At Jebel Gorab, a panel shows 3 circles connected by straight lines. Unlike typical pastoral scenes, archaeologist Carlo Bergman suggested that this panel may depict a simplified route map, possibly marking a path between seasonal lakes. Similar motifs appear in rock shelters across central Sudan, where lines between circles appear repeatedly. While this interpretation remains theoretical, the consistency of the patterns across regions strengthens the possibility. In the Sinai Peninsula, a network of standing stones stretches across narrow valleys near the old copper mines of Serabit el-Qadim. Some stones are arranged at intervals resembling way stations. Others form clusters, marking intersections of ancient paths. Bedouin traditions suggest these stones guided travelers long before formal roads existed. Archaeological analysis indicates that some stones may date back to the 4th millennium BCE or earlier. Their alignment often points toward water sources or mountain passes, hinting at a system of desert navigation built on simple, durable markers. What ties these formations together is their quiet intentionality. None are elaborate. None contain inscriptions. They rely on stone placement, orientation, and repetition. They serve as tools for remembering distance, direction, and landmark positions in landscapes too large to grasp without physical references. These proto-maps reflect a sophisticated understanding of spatial relationships among early groups who crossed deserts, hunted near ancient lakes, and traded between distant regions. Their methods influenced later pathways into the Nile Valley, when early Egyptians began formalizing trade routes and building long-distance roads. They inherited a landscape already marked by thousands of years of silent mapping. The ancient mapmakers of the desert left no written guides, but their markers, cairns, circles, trenches, and carved lines shaped the earliest human navigation across North Africa. Their faint traces remain in the sand, forming the earliest layers of spatial knowledge that later civilizations built upon. The first architects of stone alignment. Across North Africa and parts of the Sahara, long before the first dynastic kings commissioned temples and pyramids, early groups arranged stones into patterns that reflect a quiet, deliberate form of architecture. These alignments appear in open plains, on high plateaus, and along ancient lake margins. They are not megaliths on the scale of later monuments, yet they show precise placement, repetition of measurements, and a consistent awareness of direction. When viewed in their original settings, now dry and empty, they reveal a tradition of shaping space that may have formed the earliest architectural foundation inherited by the builders who later planned the Giza plateau. One of the clearest examples lies at Nabta Playa. While the site is known for its stone circle, fewer mention the long stone alignments stretching outward from the main ceremonial center. These lines form corridors, leading to water basins that existed around 6000 BCE. Archaeologist Fred Wendorf identified these alignments in the 1990 seconds and noted that several point toward the rising positions of certain stars, including Sirius. The stones are small, often no taller than a person's knee, but their placement shows consistent spacing. This suggests that the builders used simple measures, perhaps pacing or marked chords, to create straight paths across the sand. The purpose remains debated, but the alignments show a blend of astronomy and planning. Farther west, near Tassili Najer in Algeria, early pastoral groups built long rows of standing stones along the edges of ancient grasslands. These stones stand unevenly today, but early surveys from the 1950 seconds recorded their orientations. Anthropologist Henri Lotte noted that several rows align with solstice sunrise points. Others follow routes between watering holes. Their spacing suggests that the stones formed walking paths or ceremonial corridors. Though the stones themselves are small, their deliberate arrangement shows early attempts at marking boundaries or shaping movement across the land. In the central Sahara near Adrar des Ifogas, archaeologists documented a series of stone rectangles arranged in parallel rows. Each rectangle measures roughly the same width. They appear like enclosures, yet there is no evidence of domestic activity. Instead, the rectangles seem designed as gathering spaces. In 2007, archaeologist Kevin White proposed that these rectangles may have served as meeting grounds for seasonally migrating groups. The consistent dimensions of the rectangles hint at an early architectural standard, one not tied to buildings but to organizing communal space. In northern Sudan, near Wadi el Milk, long stone lanes stretch for several hundred meters. These lanes are formed by two parallel rows of stones, creating narrow corridors. Unlike desert navigation markers, which tend to point toward water, these corridors do not lead to known resources. Instead, their orientation matches the course of the ancient river that once flowed nearby. Their purpose remains unclear, but their structure suggests that early groups understood how to frame pathways using fixed stone markers. Such corridors show deliberate spatial organization long before the emergence of formal architecture. Closer to Egypt, in the eastern desert, archaeologists uncovered standing stones placed on ridges overlooking the Nile Valley. These stones, found near Wadi el Sid, appear positioned at intervals marking viewpoints. From each stone, the next is visible along the ridge. In 1973, geologist Paul Sanborn suggested these stones may have marked early trails linking Red Sea mineral sites to the Nile. Their consistent distance apart, often around the same number of steps, suggests the use of measured intervals, a precursor to later Egyptian surveying methods. A different type of alignment appears in the Western Desert near Farafra. Here, researchers discovered pairs of standing stones arranged symmetrically around narrow openings. These openings frame distant hills. Astronomer Gordon Claston analyzed their orientation in 2009 and concluded that the openings align with the heliacal rising of specific stars around 7000 BCE. If so, the stones acted as early horizon markers. Their symmetrical placement demonstrates an awareness of framing and sightlines, fundamental principles later used in temple design. On the northern edges of the Sahara, in Tunisia and Libya, hundreds of low stone mounds appear in rows across hillsides. They are not burials, they contain no artifacts. Archaeologist Ahmed Ben Youssef documented several of these mound rows and noted that they form repeating sequences of distance. Each mound in a row sits roughly the same number of meters from the next. The rows often trace the outlines of old shorelines or seasonal migration routes. This suggests that early groups used stone mounds to mark territory or pathways. Their even spacing reflects a rudimentary architectural rhythm. One of the most puzzling alignments comes from the Gilf Kebir Plateau. Along its southern edge lies a line of upright stones stretching nearly a kilometer. Some stones have collapsed, but enough remain standing to show the original structure. Unlike simple cairns, these stones are tall enough to be seen from a distance, creating a line visible across the plain. Archaeologist Carlo Bergman observed that the alignment runs parallel to the ancient courses of seasonal streams. This suggests the stones marked boundaries between grazing areas or served as ceremonial markers tied to the annual movement of water. These early alignments share several traits. They show consistent spacing, orientation toward celestial or geographic points, and careful placement of stones. They do not form buildings in the conventional sense, yet they reveal the earliest architectural instincts, organizing space, marking direction, framing views, and creating paths. These principles reappear later in Egyptian architecture, where temples align with cardinal points, sphinxes frame processional ways, and pyramids sit in carefully placed clusters. While no direct link connects the desert alignments to the builders of Giza, the quiet techniques they represent, measuring intervals, marking paths, orienting to the sky, shaping communal space, form the conceptual foundation of architectural thought. These early architects of stone alignment left no grand monuments, but their careful arrangements helped shape how later cultures organized land and built structures that echoed across millennia, the forgotten surveyors of the Green Sahara. During the early Holocene, the Sahara was not the vast desert seen today. It was a wide expanse of lakes, wetlands, and grasslands, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Nile Valley. Across this green world lived groups who traveled by foot and relied on landmarks, water sources, and seasonal winds to navigate. Their survival depended on accurate knowledge of distance and direction. Although they left no written manuals, their traces remain in the form of straight paths across plateaus, consistent pacing intervals between markers, and horizon alignments that suggest early surveying skills. These forgotten surveyors created quiet systems of measurement long before the first Egyptian architects used cords, sight poles, and plumb lines. One of the clearest signs of early surveying appears in the Fezzan region of southwestern Libya. Here, low stone cairns form long, straight lines over open plains. Archaeologist Charles Daniels surveyed these cairn lines in the 1,960 seconds and found that many extended in the same direction for several kilometers. The spacing between cairns often remained uniform. Daniels observed that the intervals between markers are too consistent to be natural, indicating deliberate pacing. The cairns likely acted as waypoints, marking routes between lakes and seasonal camps. Their uniform spacing suggests that early groups used consistent step lengths or simple counting methods to measure distance. Another striking example lies near the plateau of Tassili Naja. The landscape is rugged, but across its high plains, faint paths cut into the stone surface reveal ancient routes. These paths remain remarkably straight, even as they travel across uneven ground. A 1,985 geological study, led by Salah Amara, concluded that the straightness of the paths suggests early surveying techniques. Some paths align with distant horizon points, such as isolated peaks or notched ridgelines. These natural features likely served as fixed reference points. By aligning their movement toward recognizable silhouettes, early travelers could maintain long, straight routes without formal tools. In the Enedi region of Chad, stone alignments reveal more structured techniques. Archaeologist J. Desmond Clark identified several sites where stones form parallel lines stretching across small valleys. These lines are spaced evenly and form narrow corridors. Clark noted that the lines match the orientation of ancient lake shores. Their consistent spacing implies that their builders measured distance carefully, possibly using repeated body length measures. Such a method, simple but reliable, may have formed the basis for later Egyptian cubit systems. Another remarkable discovery comes from the Mesak Setafet Plateau in southwestern Libya. The plateau is covered with countless petroglyphs, but among them are grid engravings, straight lines carved into the rock forming rectangular shapes. These grids are not decorative. Archaeologist Savino de Lernia studied them in 2010 and proposed that they may represent early attempts at land division. The grid patterns show consistent angles and line lengths, suggesting that the engravers understood geometric principles. While their purpose remains unclear, the precision of the grids implies deliberate measurement rather than random carving. Farther east, in the western desert of Egypt, shallow trenches cut into bedrock appear in straight sequences. Near the Gilf Kebir region, several trenches align with distant landmarks on the horizon. Geologist Barbara Barrich examined these trenches in 1998 and noted that their orientation corresponds to rising and setting points of the sun during specific seasons. If the trenches marked seasonal observations or migratory timing, their creators needed consistent placement based on horizon alignments. This practice resembles later Egyptian methods for aligning temples and pyramids with astronomical events. One of the most overlooked forms of early surveying comes from rock art. Several panels across the Sahara depict groups of people walking in straight lines, often carrying sticks of equal length. At Jebel Gorab, a painting shows three figures holding rods while standing beside aligned stones. Though the meaning is uncertain, archaeologist A. Muzzolini argued that these scenes may depict surveying rituals, where sticks served as standardized units of measure. The repeated appearance of these rods across distant regions suggests they played a role in shared practices. Evidence of early pacing also emerges from the arrangement of stone mounds near the Wadi Hawa. These mounds, often placed in long lines, show spacing intervals that repeat over dozens of kilometers. When archaeologist Michael Brass analyzed the distances between mound clusters in 2017, he found consistent multiples of what appears to be a basic stride measurement. Brass suggested that early travelers used marked steps or rhythmic counting to map routes across the landscape. This technique, simple yet effective, could have been passed down through generations. Near the Algerian-Nigerian border, large stone triangulation points sit atop high ridges. These stones are arranged in triangular patterns that face open plains. Surveyors in the 1980 seconds measured their alignments and found that each triangle points to different prominent landscape features, some to distant peaks, others to lake basins. This arrangement resembles rudimentary triangulation, one of the core techniques used in later land surveying. Although the early builders likely did not use mathematical triangulation as known today, their placement of markers shows an understanding of how multiple fixed points can help map the land. The forgotten surveyors of the Green Sahara likely developed these skills gradually. As climate shifts forced populations to migrate, their knowledge became essential for locating water, tracking herds, and maintaining connections between scattered groups. When the Sahara began to dry further, many of these people moved toward the Nile Valley. They carried their methods with them: pacing, horizon alignment, landmark reference, and simple measurement standards. As early Nile communities formed larger settlements, they expanded upon this inherited knowledge. Tools like sighting rods, measuring cords, and leveling instruments appear in later Egyptian contexts, but they likely evolved from the simpler practices developed by desert surveyors. By the time the builders of Giza began planning large structures, they already possessed an understanding of straight lines, sight lines, and measured distance, shaped by thousands of years of observation across shifting landscapes. The surveyors of the Green Sahara left no written records, but their marks remained scattered across stone surfaces and desert valleys. Their quiet precision formed one of the earliest steps toward the architectural achievements that would later define the Nile civilization. The lost building methods of the Archaic West. Across the western reaches of the Sahara, where wind carves the last edges of ancient stone, silent traces of early construction still mark the ground. These traces do not fit neatly into the story of Egypt. They belong to an older and quieter tradition, one that shaped stone, leveled ground, and formed enclosed spaces long before the Nile Valley recorded its first king. The builders of this archaic West left fragments of foundations, walls reinforced with earth and stone, and surfaces flattened with a precision that suggests practiced hands. Their work stands at the far edge of memory, forming the final pieces of a world whose knowledge may have flowed eastward, eventually merging with the systems that helped shape the Giza plateau. One of the clearest examples lies in the Tadrat Akakos region of southwestern Libya. Here, archaeologists uncovered fragments of rectangular platforms carved into sandstone. Some platforms follow straight edges that measure nearly identical lengths. These edges are not natural. They show chisel-like marks pressed into the stone surface. In 1974, archaeologist Fabrizio Mori noticed that several platforms form a stepped arrangement, as if intended to hold wooden or stone uprights. Their shape resembles the supports found beneath early Nile structures, suggesting a shared tradition of elevating important spaces above ground level. The platforms predate the Old Kingdom by several millennia. Farther north, near the Ahagar Mountains, shallow stone walls trace the outlines of rectangular enclosures. These walls, often no higher than the knee, reveal a distinctive construction technique, alternating layers of stone and packed earth. The method resembles early rammed earth construction, where earth is compacted within a frame to create stability. In 1986, geologist Pierre Michel studied these walls and noted that some survived thousands of years of erosion. Their endurance hints at deliberate engineering. The builders may have used simple wooden frames to compact soil between stone rows, producing structures that resisted wind and seasonal floods. At the margins of ancient lake basins in Algeria and Mauritania, researchers found stone blocks joined with unexpected precision. These joints are not complex, yet they fit tightly enough that sand does not easily enter between them. Archaeologist Malika Harchid observed that some joints follow a slight inward bevel, forming a primitive version of the interlocking technique used later in Egyptian and Nubian masonry. The bevel reduces lateral movement, stabilizing the structure. The technique appears repeatedly along the edges of former settlements, showing that early builders understood how to control stone movement in shifting environments. Near the Adrar des Ifogas plateau, isolated stone platforms appear carved into slopes overlooking ancient pastures. These platforms show leveling marks, parallel grooves scratched into the rock surface. Surveyor Ahmed Sidi Ibrahim documented these grooves in 1993 and noted that they follow consistent depths. The grooves appear created by a flat-edged tool drawn repeatedly across the stone. Their purpose seems clear: to create flat, stable surfaces for constructing small shrines or shelters. The leveling marks resemble those found beneath early pre-dynastic Egyptian settlements, suggesting that methods for preparing building surfaces may have traveled from west to east. In the western desert of Egypt, remnants of early compounds built with stone and clay reveal another forgotten technique. At several sites between Dakhla and Karga oases, builders placed rounded stones inside walls to absorb force from shifting sand. The stones form internal buttresses, strengthening the wall without increasing thickness. Archaeologist Hans Riemer described these structures in 2004 as surprisingly resilient, noting that many survived even after their walls collapsed outward. The method resembles later Egyptian practices where mud brick walls were reinforced with internal stonework to prevent shifting during floods. One of the most puzzling building traces comes from the Mesak Setefet Plateau. Here, long strips of stone-paved ground stretch for hundreds of meters. These pavements appear formed from flattened slabs arranged in overlapping rows. Their edges follow a single orientation, forming a straight line across the plateau. Delernier's 2010 investigation revealed faint grinding marks on the slabs, as if their surfaces were shaped to fit together more smoothly. The purpose of these pavements remains uncertain. They may have served as ceremonial pathways or communal spaces. Their deliberate shaping and alignment demonstrate a level of planning usually attributed to later civilizations. Another set of early building methods appears in caves and rock shelters across the Western Sahara. At several sites, early inhabitants constructed partial stone walls within natural shelters, using precise stacking to create wind barriers. These walls reveal a technique known as dry alignment, the careful balancing of stones without mortar. The alignment follows slight inward tilts to stabilize the structure, archaeologist Eleanor C. Brooks noted that some walls display alternating stone sizes, a method that prevents collapse by distributing weight across layers. Similar techniques later appear in Old Kingdom mastaba foundations. The architectural traces become even more intriguing when compared to early pre-dynastic Egypt. At sites like Elephantine and Hierakonpolis, archaeologists uncovered early foundations made of flattened bedrock and small perimeter walls built with alternating stone and packed earth. These foundations resemble the Western platforms carved into rock. The leveling grooves beneath some Egyptian structures mirror the parallel grooves found on Saharan platforms. Even early stone joints in Upper Egypt show faint beveling similar to those found near ancient lake basins in the West. These connections do not imply a single origin. Instead, They suggest that knowledge flowed slowly across a changing landscape. As the Sahara dried between 6000 and 4000 BCE, groups moved toward the Nile. They brought with them building habits shaped by centuries of life in open plains and around disappearing lakes. They knew how to level ground, how to shape stone to match its neighbor, and how to reinforce walls against shifting elements. Their methods were simple, yet refined by repetition over generations. By the time early Egyptians began constructing larger settlements, they inherited a world already shaped by these forgotten builders. The techniques of the Archaic West, rammed earth, beveled joints, platform leveling, dry alignment, and stone paving, did not vanish. They merged quietly with emerging traditions along the Nile. And in this merging lies the final thread connecting the Western desert builders to the later architects of Egypt. Their knowledge was not written. It was carried through footsteps, shared through hands shaping stone, and preserved in the quiet endurance of structures that remain where their builders once stood. These lost methods formed one of the final foundations upon which Egypt built its early civilization, leaving subtle marks beneath the sand and forming the last echoes of the world that existed before the Pharaohs. Thank you for staying with us through this quiet journey into the world that existed before Egypt. The traces we explored, scattered stones, ancient pathways, early tools, and forgotten building methods belong to people whose names were never recorded, yet their work shaped the foundations of one of history's greatest civilizations. If this calm, detailed exploration helped you see the past in a different way, consider joining us for more. Subscribe to the channel so you can follow every new chapter as we continue uncovering the silent layers beneath familiar history. If you found meaning in this slow and peaceful style, leave a comment to share your thoughts or request the next topic you'd like us to explore. Your support helps these forgotten stories continue. Until then, rest well, stay curious, and let the mysteries of the ancient world guide you gently into the next discovery.